Fantasy football starts of the week for championship week, week 17. Brock Purdy faces the Commanders, who allow the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the second most passing yards per game this season. He's coming off of a really bad week, tossing 4 interceptions, suffered another stinger, but he's going to bounce back. Prior to week 16, Purdy finished no worse than QB 6 in 5 of his 6 games following the week 9 bye. During this span of 6 games, Purdy threw for over 300 yards in 3 of them and for 3 or 4 passing touchdowns in 4 of them. Purdy was on absolute fire, then cooled off for 1 week. Do not let 1 week derail you from playing him in your championship. Kyler Murray faces the Eagles, who allow the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 6th most passing yards per game this season. Through 6 starts this year, Kyler Murray has finished as a top 12 fantasy quarterback 3 times and has scored over 20 fantasy points in all of those specific games. Murray is coming off of a week where he threw multiple touchdowns for the first time. He also just threw for 230-plus passing yards for the 3rd time this season. Kyler Murray rushed for a touchdown in each of his first 3 starts, and he's rushed for over 40 yards twice this season. So I think the Cardinals are going to lean on this guy making plays if they want to match the Eagles' offense in Week 17. And this wouldn't be a Nick Skrip piece of content if I did not plug DeAndre Swift when he has a great matchup, especially this week against the Arizona Cardinals, who allow the most fantasy points per game to running backs and also the most rushing yards per game this season. Swift has been trending up on the ground the last 2 weeks, rushing for 74 yards in Week 15, then 92 yards and a touchdown in Week 16. Earlier this season, in Weeks 2 and 3, he rushed for 175 and 130 rushing yards, which shows the upside that he has on the ground in this Eagles offense. Swift has scored 15-plus fantasy points across 6 weeks this season, and his 15.2 points in Week 16 is a sign of more points to come. 20 touches in back-to-back games is a great sign heading into a great running back matchup in Week 17. Javonte Williams faces the Chargers, who allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Javonte has not been touching the ball or producing the way we'd like to as of late, but I feel like there are aspects of this game script that can be in his favor for Week 17. The first is the Broncos benching Russell Wilson for the remainder of the season because of financial reasons. The next is the Broncos defense, who has been playing better, are playing the Chargers led by Easton Stick. So I feel like there could be plenty of opportunity here to run the ball. And we can also look back at the first matchup between these two teams in Week 14, where Javonte carried the ball 17 times for 66 yards and a touchdown, and he also caught 3 passes for 25 yards. Javonte Williams scored 18-ish fantasy points in that matchup against the Chargers, which was the 2nd time this season he's done that. And Javonte has rushed for a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. So I like his odds to have another good game against the Chargers in Week 17. Rashee Rice faces the Bengals, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards per game this season. The Chiefs rookie came down to earth in Week 16 after a hot streak of 4 games of solid production. Looking at Weeks 12 through 15, Rice earned 10, 9, 10, and 9 targets and produced 107, 64, 72, and 91 receiving yards with 3 touchdowns scored. That meant scores of 24.7, 14.4, 18.2, and 24.1 points for the rookie during that span. He was on fire, and even in a down Week 16, we had a very good sign, and that was a season-high 12 targets from Patrick Mahomes. Love him to bounce back in Week 17. Now let's get a little bit spicier, because it's cooler to say I told you so about guys like Adam Thielen and Noah Brown over like A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill. So Adam Thielen faces the Jaguars, who allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 4th most passing yards per game this season. DJ Chark was the standout in Carolina last week for the wide receiver room because he finished with 98 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. But Adam Thielen quietly was good as well. Thielen tied Chark for a team-high 8 targets. He caught 6 of them for 94 receiving yards. Thielen has cooled off after the bye week, but we have to remember he was on fire earlier this season. He's finished 3 weeks as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver and 7 weeks as a top 24 fantasy wide receiver. This has meant 8 weeks of 15-plus fantasy points and 4 weeks of 20-plus fantasy points. I feel like following their bye week, Carolina was trying to emphasize their rookie wide receiver, Jonathan Mingo, when it came to target share, but nothing really was happening there. So I feel like last week was a good indicator of more volume to come to Adam Thielen, who looked good, and Bryce Young is coming off of his best game of the season. Now let's talk Noah Brown, who I feel like is a good flex option for Week 17. The Titans allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. In Week 15 against the Titans, in that first matchup, Noah Brown caught 8 of his 11 targets for 82 receiving yards and a touchdown for 22.2 fantasy points with Nico Collins out. Then in Week 16, Nico Collins returned to the lineup, but Noah Brown out-targeted him 7-6. It's looking like there's a good chance C.J. Stroud returns to the lineup in Week 17, which is a good thing for Noah Brown because he's had some explosive weeks with the rookie quarterback. Back in Week 10, Stroud playing, Nico Collins out again. Noah Brown caught 7 of his 8 targets for 172 receiving yards and scored 24.2 fantasy points. In the game prior to that one, with both C.J. Stroud and Nico Collins playing, Brown caught all 6 of his targets for 153 receiving yards and a touchdown for 27.3 fantasy points. So we've had a mixture of good games with and without both C.J. Stroud and Nico Collins. And with 3 top 10 fantasy finishes this season, I feel like Noah Brown is a good upside flex to play in Week 17. But he's currently questionable, so keep an eye on that. Then last, for the tight end position, I like Gerald Everett against the Broncos, who allow the most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season and the 9th most passing yards per game. Gerald Everett is coming off of his 4th top 12 fantasy football week of the season. He caught 7 of his 8 targets for 42 yards. What stands out about Gerald Everett is the target consistency the last 3 weeks. It's 3 straight games of 8 targets earned. We're not entirely sure if Keenan Allen is going to return to the lineup. I feel like he's not going to because the Chargers don't have much to play for. But regardless, I like Gerald Everett, who has been very involved in this offense, to stay involved in a great matchup for Week 17. Everett has also finished with over 40 receiving yards in 4 of his 5 last games played. Best of luck this week, guys. Go and get those ships.